Volunteering abroad can be an incredible way to experience a new country if you find the right gig, but not every opportunity is what it seems. Don't get me wrong, some hosts are amazing. They offer a fair exchange and a welcoming environment. Others not so much. So, how do you tell the difference? How do you read between the lines of a listing, spot the red flags, and make sure you don't end up in a situation that's more free labor than cultural exchange? And if you do find yourself in a bad spot, what's your exit strategy? In this video, I'll break down how to choose a volunteer gig wisely, what precautions to take, and how to handle things if they go south. Hi, I'm Basha, and if you've been following this channel, you know I've spent years living abroad, including a few nomadic years hopping from one volunteer experience to another. It was an exciting time, immersing myself in new cultures, doing meaningful work, and always looking ahead to the next adventure. But not every experience was smooth sailing. Along the way, I learned how to be more discerning when choosing the right opportunity, and how to avoid the kinds of situations that sound great on paper but don't quite live up to the promise. Now I want to share what I've learned so that if you're considering volunteering abroad, you can go in prepared and find an experience that truly works for you. So let's dive in. First of all, there are tons of online platforms for volunteering abroad. The ones I'll be focusing on are the types that are meant to be a cultural exchange and usually, but not always, involve nonprofit endeavors and hook volunteers up with free room and board. I've put some links down below, so after the video, have fun browsing. Now, once you've identified a volunteering opportunity, your first step is going to be to read the description carefully. Does the purpose of the project resonate with you? Is it a good match? Be honest with yourself. Do you really qualify? Here's an example of a potential mismatch. I talked in one of my earlier videos about volunteering at a cat hostel. Now, there was another volunteer who had been there for several months before me, and she was showing me the ropes. And one day a new cat came in, and she told me this cat is really vicious. So before she goes into the cage that the cat was staying in, she put on knee-high leather boots, and I think even some sort of protective gloves. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? And so while she was in there cleaning up the cage, I did the little, I don't know if you know how to make a cat feel at ease with you, but you just do this. In cat language, that's a sign of non-aggression. And just tried to connect with it across the cage. And pretty soon I thought, this cat is not vicious, because he was winking back at me. And so I just opened the cage and I went in, and he climbed into my lap and we were cuddling. And this other volunteer was just amazed because apparently she'd had a bad experience. Well, one thing I didn't mention about her was that she was traveling with her dog. And I'm sure she loved all animals, but she didn't really know cats. And so if you're going to be working with animals or children, it's better if you already know that you're capable of doing it before you claim that you are. Another question to ask yourself is, are you physically fit enough to handle the work? Here's another example. I was volunteering at a horse farm in Germany, and one of the main jobs was mucking out the horses' stalls while they were out to pasture. And the host told me she didn't like to hire volunteers who were used to living in big cities because they had a very idealistic notion of what it would be like to work with horses. And she gave an example of two young volunteers that came, and it took them 4 hours together to muck out one stall. And I was, how old? I was in my mid to late 50s at the time, and I was doing between 4 and 6 stalls in the same amount of time. So if you're not sure that you can handle the work, maybe it's better to pass on to a different type of volunteer opportunity, or at least let the host know up front that you haven't had any experience, but you'd like to learn, and then they can decide if they want to take a chance on you, because sometimes they really need the help and they can't have volunteers who can't handle the work. You also want to take a look and see if there are any conditions that you can't handle. For example, do you have special dietary requirements that aren't going to be met by the meals that the host is providing you? What about the number of hours that are required of you, or the distance from civilization? Now, a lot of times in their ads, hosts kind of like to exaggerate the amount of free time you're going to have and how easy it is to get to and from where they are and where all the sites are. In my experience, the hosts who will give you a lift into town are few and far between. So you want to look at the environment you're going to be staying in for the amount of time you're going to be there and ask yourself, if I don't get to go out sightseeing, am I going to be happy with this volunteer situation? Will I find enough to do? Will I be happy just working on the project and hanging out with the host and the other volunteers? If not, keep scrolling. Here's one that most volunteers don't even think about looking at, but it's an important one. Is the business or project that you're looking at a for-profit endeavor or a non-profit endeavor? This might very well affect your experience. And I would ask myself, if it's a for-profit endeavor, why are they using volunteers and not hiring people? Are they just circumventing the local labor laws in most cases? Yes. So you're going to want to check the labor laws in the country where you're planning to volunteer to make sure that it's okay for you to volunteer there on a tourist visa, or if not, what kind of visa do you need to get in order to be able to do that kind of work? Do you need a work permit? Do you need a student permit? Something else. Check with your local consulate. As an example, I did a couple of volunteering gigs many years ago for an organization called WOOF, which used to stand for Willing Workers on Organic Farms. Now it's Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And at that time it wasn't a problem, and I just wanted to get myself updated on, first of all, do they still exist, and have they updated anything? And I was surprised to see this notice on the Norwegian site. Every country has its own WOOF site. Nationals from outside the EU EEA are currently advised not to sign up or use the WOOF Norway platforms due to Norwegian Immigration Authority's classification of WOOF as work without a visa. Anyone from a non-EU EEA country traveling with a tourist visa that is caught woofing could face arrest, deportation, and a possible ban from the EU and Schengen zone. That really came as a surprise to me, because I didn't see these kind of warnings almost 20 years ago when I was woofing in Norway. And I kind of checked the other countries in Europe, and I didn't see that sign on any of the other countries, but I thought, I wonder if the same thing is true for some of the other volunteering platforms. So I went to one of the other volunteering platforms, Workaway, workaway.info, and I found a bunch of these notices, like this one for Italy. If you are from outside of the EU and planning to visit Italy to work, volunteer, or study, you will need the correct visa. To find out more information, you need to contact the embassy in your home country before traveling. They say embassy, but it's actually the consulate that can help you with visa issues. So I went to a bunch of different countries in Europe on the Workaway platform, and every single country had that same disclaimer. So then I thought, is it just Europe or is it all over the world? So I started checking around, and here's what I found. The countries I found that require potentially a work visa in order to do volunteering included Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Are we seeing a pattern here? Also Japan, and in a tiny red note that was not nearly as noticeable, Turkey and Israel, which are kind of outliers. So I hope this doesn't scare you away from volunteering. It's not saying that you can't volunteer. It's saying you need to do it on the proper visa. And the best thing to do is go to the consular website, look at what it says. If it's not clear, pick up your phone and talk to somebody. They'll be happy to help you. And then you'll get the most up-to-date and correct information so you don't put yourself at risk. So once you've got all that out of the way, you need to ask yourself, am I going to be safe? Is there a socio-political situation that could endanger me, like an uprising or a revolution or something like that? There's a lot of information online. It's not always easy to find up-to-date information. However, the U.S. State Department issues travel advisories around the world, and even if you're not a U.S. citizen, you can access the website to see what they have to say about it, and they'll let you know if there's terrorist activity, what kind of natural disasters to look out for, and a lot of other things, crime. I think they do tend to err on the side of caution, but that's a good thing if you want to make sure to keep yourself safe. Now, if you are a U.S. citizen, you can log onto the site and register for their STEP program, which stands for Smart Travel Program. And that way, they know where you are, and you can get real-time updates about health, weather, safety, and security in the country that you're in. It can also help the embassy or consulate to contact you if there's an emergency like a natural disaster, civil unrest, or a family emergency. So it's a pretty good thing. Now, if you're not worried about any of this and want to stay under the wire, you can do that too. It's not required to register, but it's there as a service. And of course, you can always Google the current situation and combine your country with words like terrorists, crime, etc. There are a lot of websites that rank the crime rates in various countries. Although I have noticed that there is a wide variety among the different sites as to which countries they rank as high in crime. So my advice to you would be to check several sites and kind of take the average of the mean or something like that. Average of the mean makes no sense, but and the volunteer platforms may sometimes offer this kind of information as well. For example, the Workaway platform issues a travel advisory for travel to Israel if you're not from there. Another great thing to do to prepare yourself for your volunteer experience is to learn about cultural norms in the place you're going to be going to. And here's especially for women, if you're going to be staying with a male host, for example, you're going to want to be sure that you understand what assumptions might be made about you, especially if you're there alone with your male host, assumptions either by him or his neighbors or other people, and how that's going to affect you, whether or not you'd be putting yourself at risk. But there's also simple things like meal times. For example, my nephew and his girlfriend did a few volunteer gigs in Europe, and they were complaining. In fact, I think they even made a complaint online in their review of the host about the meals, because they only got one hot meal during their day, and that was the midday meal. So breakfast was something cold and dinner was something cold. Well, the thing is that in Europe, people have a cold breakfast, usually a continental breakfast like a piece of fruit or a bread roll and some coffee or something like that. And lunch is the main meal of the day, and that's your hot meal. And then at dinner, they just do sandwiches or put stuff on bread, cheese and bread, peanut butter, whatever, and maybe some fruit. So that's the norm in Europe. And so expecting 3 hot meals a day was really asking a lot for where they were at. So those are the kind of things that you may want to check out in advance, or if it's not that big of a deal to you, just, remember to be flexible and accept that things abroad are not necessarily going to be the same as the way they were at home. The next thing you're going to want to do before you decide for sure on a volunteer gig is to read the reviews. Most of the platforms have reviews where the host can review the volunteers and the volunteers can review the host. Now, when I was volunteering with WOOF, they didn't have such a thing, and I sure wish they had, because both of my experiences were pretty negative, and I know that's not necessarily true for all WOOF experiences, but I sure wish I had known a lot of things before I went to either of those 2 assignments. So I thought, well, maybe in 20 years they've updated things and now they've got it where you can review each other. Well, guess what? As far as I could tell, they have not updated the website to include reviews. And I think that's really a shame, because if you're going to give up part of your vacation or spend a good chunk of your time helping somebody work on their farm, then you're going to want to know that you're going to be treated fairly, that you're not going to be exploited, and that you're going to have enough to eat, for example. So, WOOF, get your act together. Now, just reading the reviews may not always be enough. You'll probably notice as you go through reviews that some volunteers give a glowing review to their host, but not top stars. They may only give 3 stars out of 5. Why is that? Is there something they're not trying to say? If you come across something like this and it's an experience that you really want to have, you might want to contact that volunteer and find out what really went on. And most of the platforms will have a way for you to do that directly through a mailbox on the platform itself. And you can learn a lot. Sometimes it was just a personal conflict and maybe you won't have that same conflict, but sometimes there are some real issues and volunteers will word things in such a way that you kind of get the feeling that everything wasn't really okay, but they're not coming out and saying it. So why would they want to do that? Why would they want to lead you astray? Well, the sad truth is that some volunteers are afraid of retaliation. For example, it's not like, with Airbnb, you get a chance to write a review and the other person doesn't get to see your review until they write theirs or until it's too late for them to write one. So it's not that way on some of those sites. So they can see your review and they could retaliate if they don't like what you say. And whether what they retaliate with is valid or not, well, that's all up to you. But another thing is that by putting a negative review on a platform like that, if you're planning on applying for more volunteer positions, you don't really want to seem like a complainer, because some hosts might look at that and go, okay, let's just pass on this person. But if there are some real problems, I think that you should say it, because it really helps other volunteers to know what to expect. That's the whole idea of doing the reviews. But I think that's probably why some volunteers hold back. So really your best bet is to just contact volunteers like that and see if they're willing to tell you what the problem was. Another thing you're really going to want to pay attention to is the ad, for lack of a better word, that the host put out to describe their project and what they expect of volunteers. And you need to learn how to read between the lines. One thing that I really started paying attention to is, are they hypercritical of other volunteers? Look at the reviews that they've written and also just what they say. For example, I knew a retired couple who had children or grandchildren in Spain, and they were running some sort of a goat farm, and they knew that I really love goats, and so they recommended this volunteer experience to me because they were on Workaway or one of the volunteer sites. And I looked at their profile and it looked like really interesting work, and they said something like, if you can't work independently and you need to have your hand held at every step along the way, then don't bother applying. It was kind of like in that tone exactly. It's not word for word because this was quite a few years ago and I couldn't find it again. But I thought to myself, well, I'm very independent. I prefer working independently and I certainly don't need my hand held. But the attitude that came across was like, I really don't want to get to know these people. And I don't want to be in a situation where I'm going to end up wanting to leave before the time that I agree to stay there. So above and beyond that kind of thing, read the description well and ask yourself, are they expecting you to do something that you're not willing to do? Maybe it's work that you find gross or disgusting, or you have some ethical concerns with, or just work that you just don't want to do. It doesn't trip your trigger. And do they seem like people that you'd enjoy hanging out with? And here's another potential red flag. I say potential because in some cases it's legitimate, but are they asking you to pay for accommodation and food? In most cases, they shouldn't be, especially in developed countries, and especially if it's a for-profit business, which they really shouldn't be using volunteers anyway. But if it's a developed country that has a good economy, and they're asking you to pay for accommodation, that would kind of raise my eyebrows. The exception to that is nonprofit organizations that are working on a really tight budget, or nonprofits, especially in third world countries, where they really can't afford to put you up and pay for your food. but the amount that they charge you is really equal to what it costs them. And a lot of volunteer platforms allow nonprofits to do just that, because otherwise they would never be able to host volunteers. So trust your gut on that one. You know, if it seems legit and you're okay with paying for accommodation, go for it, but just make sure that you know ahead of time what to expect. And then, you know, once you've agreed on doing volunteer work with a particular project, fulfill your part of the bargain. Do the work that you're asked to do and do it well. Put in the hours, and if you have the time and the energy, don't be afraid to go the extra mile and give some added value to your stay there, because whatever you put into it, you're going to get that much back. And I'm not talking about exploitative situations. We talked about that in the last video, and you definitely don't want to feel that you're being exploited. But, you know, if the host has done a good job of describing the work that you're required to do and the hours that you need to put in, you should come prepared to do that. And if for any reason you need to cancel before you go, then please be sure to let the host know as soon as you know, because they may be depending on you and they may be turning away other volunteers because you've reserved a place. And I was volunteering one time at this horse farm in Germany, and it was just me and the host. She was really down to just the two of us. We were struggling to keep up with getting the horses fed and put out to pasture and getting the stalls mucked. I had to do all the mucking because she had a physical disability and she literally couldn't handle it all by herself. And we were really kind of excited because there was an American volunteer who'd been in contact with her for some time. And then he contacted her again and he said, yeah, I finally decided I want to come, I want to do it. And so in the meantime, there were other people that contacted her and wanted to volunteer, but she only had so much space available. And so she did turn down some other volunteers. The time was approaching, you know, when he should have been coming, or at least letting us know when he was going to be there, and we heard nothing from him. So she finally wrote to him, and he wrote back and said, oh yeah, well, I'd been in contact with this other place in Finland, and I really like that opportunity better, so I'm going to go with that one. And he didn't let her know that he was also communicating with this other farm that he might not end up coming. He made it seem like it was definite. You don't want to do that to somebody. And this is sometimes why hosts can turn sour on volunteers, because it works both ways. There are volunteers who also take advantage of hosts, and that is not cool. If you're not going to do what you say you're going to do, or you're not going to let people know if you can't fulfill your commitment, then volunteering is not for you. So let's assume that you've done everything right, you've shown up for your volunteer opportunity, and at first things are going great, and then suddenly things go south. What I want you to remember, first and foremost, is that your main responsibility is to yourself. The one exception to that is if you're alone and you're going to be responsible for vulnerable people or animals, then you know, you can't really just ditch them. I don't think it's very often that you'll be alone in a situation like that. Most of the time when you're caring for, especially for people, you know, kids or elderly adults, you probably won't be alone. The host will be there with you. Sometimes you may be alone taking care of animals, and you can't just abandon them and let them starve to death, right? So here's what my strategy would be in a situation like that, where I just really could not put up with the situation anymore, if it was that bad for one reason or another, and I can't really think of what that would be, but a lot of things crop up that you can never imagine. My strategy would be first to contact the host and ask them to come back, let them know what's going on, you know, in good faith that you just can't complete it. And this is also if an emergency comes up, like somebody in your family needs you and you need to get back home. Contact the host first and make arrangements for them to come back. If they don't do that, if they really are taking advantage of you and they're not coming back, then I think what I would do next is threaten that I'm going to leave so they have to come back and hope they don't call my bluff, because to tell you the truth, I wouldn't really leave in that situation. But you really need to put your foot down. And if they still don't come back, or if they keep, dragging you along for a period of time, and you feel like they're just taking advantage, then what I would do is contact the platform that put you together in the first place and ask for help. And they will generally help you, because they want to make sure that their platform maintains a good reputation. And some of them, I think, I was on Workaway recently, just looking at their site, and they actually have an emergency procedure where if something is truly egregious and it is totally the host's fault and not your fault, then they will even pay for accommodation and stuff like that. So they are the people to turn to if you can't work it out with the host, but try working it out with the host first. Now, of course, if the hosts are there, you can leave any time. You are not obligated to stay. It's not a prison sentence. It's not a work contract. And ultimately, the work is their responsibility. So if they don't maintain the conditions that make it possible for you to stay there and thrive, then I would feel no compunction about leaving. And I have done that once or twice. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where you're actually afraid for your personal safety, then get out of Dodge as soon as you can. And if you're afraid that even telling your host is going to make them become violent or unpleasant in some other way, go ahead and leave first if you can, if you're not reliant on them for transportation, and send them a text later letting them know you're gone. Just keep yourself safe. And be sure to always have mad money with you. A lot of hosts, not a lot, okay, some hosts that I've volunteered for, they seem to have this attitude that the volunteers have to stay there and have to put up with whatever they'll dish out because they can't afford not to. And that may actually be true for some volunteers. They may not plan ahead and they may not budget for just having to, take flight. So always make sure you have enough money to get transportation out of there, get yourself to a hostel or a hotel, or get back home, or whatever it is that you think you're going to need to do. Now, one thing I want to say, just some horror stories that I've heard. I haven't experienced this myself, but sometimes, especially if it's farm work where the people who are running the farm don't actually live on the farm, sometimes volunteers are transported to remote areas to do the work, and then they're transported back at the end of the day, or sometimes they have to stay in those remote areas. So make sure to check if you have any kind of weird feelings about it. Be sure to check, especially with former volunteers, to find out what the situation was like. If it's not clear from the ad, are you going to be living with the farmers on the farm, or are they going to be taking you somewhere? Because if you're in the middle of a workday, for example, you can't get back on your own. And I did hear of one situation, I can't remember the country it was either someplace in Africa or Southeast Asia, and the volunteers were transported a very long distance away from their meeting point, and they were kept in almost prison-like conditions for a number of months. You do not want to be in that kind of a situation. So I think it's really very important, especially if you're just starting out and you don't really know how to have a feel for these things. And even if you do have a feel for things, you can be wrong. Check with former volunteers. That's really your best bet. Some positions don't have any reviews from former volunteers. Maybe they're just starting out. It's up to you whether you want to take a chance with them, but I would start out with something that has reviews, has great reviews, and just see how it goes from there. Now, I hope none of this has scared you away from the idea of volunteering abroad, because if you find the right match and make sure you're complying with all the legal requirements, and you're really there to contribute to the project, it can be an amazing or even life-altering experience, maybe one that you'll look back on fondly for the rest of your life. And if you go in prepared, you're much more likely to have a great experience. Of course, not everything can be anticipated. Sometimes things go wrong for reasons even the host can't control. That's why adaptability is key. But here's the bottom line. Volunteering should be a fair exchange, not a test of endurance. If a situation isn't working for you, don't be afraid to walk away. There will always be other opportunities that truly align with your goals and values.